one of the questions that made me think about is where have we been successful and not successful in merging research on computer algorithms with research in neuroscience? And I think my impression, even before today, but certainly after this week's set of talks, is that it's mostly in the area of perception, vision, and to some degree audition, speech, are areas where, for example, in computer vision and in studies of human vision, we see now some convergence. But we've been remarkably unproductive in getting synergy at more human-like knowledge intensive kinds of understanding of those kinds of processes, reasoning and so forth. And I can't, and when I think about what will it take, how can we make progress in that direction, it seems to me that language is the key. It's the opening into that part of our brains. Language lets us, it involves thinking, involves complex inference, it involves representing meaning of things beyond visual scenes that we're seeing. And so what I want to talk about here is some research that we've been doing. When I say we, I mean a collection of people whose work I'll be discussing. And the main questions we've been looking at really have to do with trying to understand language-oriented activity in the brain. So how does neural activity encode word representations? If I get you to think about hand or sailboat, what's the difference in the neural representation of those things? Is there some systematicity underneath that? Can we study it? Can we understand that? How does the brain combine these meanings of individual words into meanings of sentences and paragraphs and beyond? And the approach that we've been taking is brain imaging using both fMRI, because that gives us a 1 millimeter spatial resolution to look at the brain, and MEG, magnetoencephalography, because that gives us 1 millisecond time resolution, although it weakens our spatial resolution to about the size of a golf ball, ping pong ball. But if you look at those, if you can use both of those, you can try to get an angle both on space and time. Another characteristic of our approach is that it's interesting because of the revolution that's happened in the last 20 years with brain imaging, we now can see neural activity in the brain, which we could never see before. But what we really want to see is not just the neural activity, it's what's the information coded in that neural activity. So a large part of our method involves trying to train machine learning systems to decode information that's represented by that neural activity in different times and different places in the brain. So let me show you what I mean by that. Think about, does anybody know how long it takes you to understand a word? Most people read about 3 words per second when you read the morning newspaper. And a good number is if I put a word up on the screen for you to read, it takes you about 400 milliseconds to understand that word. Because MEG gives us 1 millisecond time resolution, I can show you a movie of that 400 milliseconds while this brain sees the stimulus hand. And in this case, the stimulus is presented both H-A-N-D, a word, and also with a line drawing simultaneously of a hand. And here's what the movie looks like. So here's the brain. Down here in the left corner, you see minus 20 milliseconds. That means the movie starts 20 milliseconds before the stimulus appears on the screen. You watch the movie, and I will read out to you when it's 100 milliseconds, 200 milliseconds, and so forth. Here's what happens when the stimulus appears on the screen. Okay, the word's on the screen. 100 milliseconds. 200, 300 milliseconds, 400. That brain just understood what the word was. So you see the dynamics here. It's not at all suddenly your brain lights up with this static picture of neural activity. There's an amazing amount of dynamics there. Brain activity is flowing around. And this is a very interesting movie. I've watched this movie over 100 times, and many like it. It gets better every time you watch it. But it's not the movie that I want. That's the movie of the neural activity. The movie that I want is a movie of the information flow, the data flow in the brain during that 400 milliseconds. So let me show you the approximation to that movie, which is due to Gus Sudre, one of our former PhD students, who trained roughly 500,000 different classifiers. Each classifier took as input a 50 millisecond window of that movie and looked at the activity in one of 72 regions of the brain defined anatomically. And it, for each classifier that looked at one region for 50 milliseconds, it tried to decode one semantic feature of the word. Semantic feature would be, for example, is it bigger than a bus? Is this word describing something bigger than a bus? Or something that's alive? Okay. And he tried several hundred features that we made up, motivated by the game 20 questions, if you know that game. And here's what he found. He found those 500,000, roughly, classifiers could not detect any semantic content about the stimulus during the first 50 milliseconds. During the next 50 milliseconds, there were some features that could be decoded. They were all not about the semantics of the stimulus, but word length, for example, the number of characters in the word. In the case of the line drawing, the fact that whether it was right diagonal or vertical and things like that. Between 100 and 150 milliseconds, same thing, more perceptual features. 200 milliseconds, some more perceptual features, and the first semantic feature, is it hairy, which I think is a proxy for is it alive. 250, 300. So this is the kind of movie that I want. And this is the kind of movie that we can get if we effectively train classifiers to be virtual sensors of the information content of the neural signal. And so this allows us to lift up our study of the brain so that we can talk both about where's the neural activity and about where and when does the information get coded in that neural activity. So the brain teaser for the rest of the talk is to figure out how can we use that as a tool to study meaning representations and language processing in the brain. Okay, so let me drill down a little bit on this analysis first, because before we did this experiment, didn't really have answered to very basic questions like, what happens during those 400 milliseconds? Does your brain work on understanding the word and then figure it out and instantly light up all of the meaning representation? Or does it trickle in over time? As you saw, it trickles in over time. But then when it trickles in, does it persist? Does it move, do semantic features move around? Does the information flow around the brain? And so let's look at just a couple of these features to give you the answer to that. The way you read this particular slide shows the feature word length, the number of letters in the word. So it's a perceptual feature. And the way you read this is that this axis is time since stimulus onset in milliseconds. This axis is the 70 different regions of the brain. And so each point in this matrix tells us the decoding accuracy, how much that region of the brain at that time encodes the feature number of letters in the word. And so you can see very clearly, red means high accuracy, blue means chance, that there are certain regions of the brain which all at once, if you can't read those, it's left and right cuneus, lateral occipital, lingual, paracalcarine, sulcus, left and right, and so forth. But they all independently contain neural activity at around 100 to 150 milliseconds that allows you to, that encodes the word length. It doesn't persist for very long. Remember, it takes you 400 milliseconds to understand the word. By then, that information isn't even coded in the brain. It's gone. Take a look at a different feature, grasping. Is the word that you're reading describing something that's graspable? And this is a feature that appears much later than that word length. This one appears, again, pretty much across several different regions simultaneously at around 250, 300 milliseconds. And again, it appears several places in the brain simultaneously, and then it does persist. In fact, it persists beyond the 400 millisecond point when your brain figures out the word. Also, notice, just because we're going to notice this in several of these, the left supramarginal gyrus, which is now one of my favorite parts of the brain, codes this information at around 400 milliseconds. In fact, a lot of the features suddenly appear coded in the left supramarginal gyrus around 400 milliseconds. Here's another one, animacy. This one's much earlier. In fact, animacy-related features are the earliest ones that we see in that trickle of semantic features coming in. These occur around 150 to 200 milliseconds, again, simultaneously across several regions, and they do, again, persist. Once they're coded, they tend to persist beyond the 400 millisecond mark. And there, over here in supramarginal gyrus again, that feature ends up coded at about 400. So this is the kind of data flow diagram that we can, information flow diagram that we can start to build looking at codings of individual words. If you ask, out of the 218 semantic features that Gus tried to decode from this kind of data, which were the most decodable, here's the answer. Here are the top 20. And if you look at those a little bit, you see a number of them have to do with size, manipulability, animacy, shelter. And we found across many, many studies that these are key dimensions in the coding of meaning of individual concepts, whether they're nouns or pictures of those nouns. These and edibility is the fifth one that comes in very frequently. So let me skip over this because I want to be sure I have time. So what I want to do is I just want to present 4 or 5 snippets of kinds of results that we've been able to get. This one clearly is what I just presented is clearly an attempt to try to dissect what's going on during those 400 milliseconds and try to understand what's the evolution of information. So now we have a partial handle on where and when in the brain that information is coded. We still do not have a handle on how the brain actually generates that. But one of the questions that should come to mind is, are these neural codes built up from more primitive information? Or are they, it could have been that evolution could have designed us with hash codes for meaning, but in fact it didn't. And one proof of that is that we're able to train a model, a computer model, that takes as input an arbitrary noun in English and produces as output a prediction of the fMRI spatial pattern of neural activity for that noun. This model works by in 2 steps. First, it looks up the word in a very large collection of text provided by Google from the web. And second, it uses the set of corpus statistics features. Basically, it represents the word as a vector of corpus statistics. Like if this is the word telephone, it'll be how often does telephone co-occur, say, with the verb call, or the verb eat, or the verb hug, or the verb run, and so forth. And then in a second step, it predicts the neural activity from that vector. So, for example, if we give this system the word celery, which it has never seen during training, the first thing it will do is code it with a vector like this. Celery occurs a lot with eat and taste, not very much with ride, whereas airplane occurs a lot with ride, but not much with rub and manipulate. So these are and this is part of our methodology too. When we train these classifiers, we don't train them with an atomic label, but instead we basically train them to predict a vector like this. And this vector is a canonical representation for meaning across any word. Therefore, when we train the model to predict neural activity from these vectors, we can test whether it can extrapolate to new words it has not seen, because we can also code those new words with this vector representation. So if you do this, then the prediction for the neural activity at each voxel is simply a weighted linear combination we know celery occurs this frequently with the verb eat and this frequently with taste, then its prediction for the activity at voxel V is the sum over those 25 verbs that it's using of how frequently that verb occurs with that word times some coefficient which is learned during training. So it's a very large linear regression problem, fairly simple technique, but allows it to predict then images like this. If you ask how good are its predictions, I can show you, here's an example of predictions for two words that were not included in training the model. And below you see the actual, not known to the program, observed fMRI images for those two words. So it's not a perfect predictor, but you can see there's structure that it's getting right. You can ask also how well does it, you can make a quantitative measure of how well it works by asking, if we give it two words like celery and airplane, which it hadn't seen, and then we give it the two fMRI images and we ask which one is celery, which one is airplane. At chance, it would be 50% correct. And when we train the model and test it, it's 79% correct. So it really is capturing systematicity in the neural coding, which allows it to make predictions for words that it has not yet seen. And the only way those predictions could be correct is if the systematicity that it's capturing really does hold in the world. So what is that systematicity? Essentially, this model is assuming that every word can be represented in this 25-dimensional space of verbs, and those 25 dimensions also correspond to coefficient arrays like the ones along the top. Basically, it's assuming that any word's neural activity can be represented as a weighted linear combination of 25 subpatterns, primitive meaning components, which you might call eat and taste and fill and so forth. Now that can't quite be true. Well, we hope our brains are more subtle than that. But still, this shows that there is a kind of systematicity there that really does exist. And if you look at the learned coefficients, the learned contributions to the full pattern from those meaning components, and you ask, what are the definitions of the meaning components? Then you see that for about half of them, like push, we can relate the activity that they have learned to assign to that verb to regions of the brain that we know are actually associated with the functions of that semantic. So biological motion, often in superior temporal lobe, and gustatory cortex is sometimes the name people use for pars opercularis, which is the region that these coefficients are giving. Okay, so the point there is that For individual words, there is a systematicity for how they're coded, and it holds in a way that we can actually train models that can predict, extrapolate to make predictions for new words we haven't looked at. Okay, so let's move on from single words to multiple words. So we're interested also in questions like semantic composition. If we see the brain represent a word like angry and a word like cat, then how does that turn into the representation for angry cat? Or if we read a sentence or a story, what's the information flow in the brain during that? So Alana Feisch, another of our PhD students, did a study of adjective noun phrases. She presented adjective for 500 milliseconds, 300 milliseconds of delay, and then a noun for 500 milliseconds. She used MEG imaging, and she tried to decode things like the adjective and the noun and the composed meaning, again using a corpus statistics semantic representation for those things. And one of the questions she asked, which I think is a very interesting one, is, well, first question she asked is, can we decode the adjective while you're reading it from your neural activity? The answer is yes, with 90% accuracy. Second question is, can we decode the adjective that you had read when the noun is on the screen? The answer is yes, with about 73% accuracy. She asked, can we decode it after the phrase is gone? The answer is yes. During the next second or two, you can still, the traces of the adjective neural activity are still in your head. You can see that. Then she asked a very interesting question. Does the brain use the same neural code during each of those three times? Or is it a different neural representation of the adjective during those three periods? And so what she did is she actually trained a decoder of the adjective on a 100 millisecond window of MEG activity at time, let's call it T1, and then she tested whether that trained classifier trained at time T1 would work at time T2, and she tried that for all variations of T1 and T2. So I could show you a plot of the training time by the test time, and it looks like this. So this is the time when the adjective is presented and then the noun. That's training time. Here's the same time scale, but now we're testing. And so, for example, this point here along the diagonal says if you train when the noun is on the screen and test cross-validated at the same time, then the red indicates you can decode this quite accurately. So in fact, this red diagonal means, yeah, if you train and test on the same time window, you can decode the adjective when it's on the screen, when the noun's on the screen, and later. But interestingly, if you try to train when the adjective is on the screen and then decode any other time when the adjective is on the screen, it pretty much works. But as soon as the noun is on the screen, it's a different neural code. You can still decode it if you trained when the noun is on the screen, you learn the right pattern. But this neural representation of the adjective when you were reading it is no longer the one that you see. However, if you wait until the noun disappears and wait a little longer, then over here you can again decode what the adjective had been using its original encoding. So I'm not quite sure how to interpret that, but it does mean at minimum that the adjective is in fact modulating your neural activity both when you're reading it and subsequently when you're reading the noun, and then subsequently after you're all done. But the way in which it modulates that, the code, the pattern of neural activity, is there are two of them. One is here and again here, and then there's a different one that occurs when you're reading the noun. So this is kind of interesting. Even more interesting is when you look at the codes that are learned it turns out the one when you're reading the noun is nearly the inverse of the pattern of activity when you're reading the adjective. Let me show you. So here is a plot of the learned weights. I should say this is the time when the adjective is on the screen and later when the noun is on the screen. These are different MEG sensors in the frontal, temporal, and parietal region, respectively. The points that you see here, the colors, indicate the weight of a linear classifier that's trying to predict the semantic vector of the adjective. So basically, what this is saying, blue means negative weight, red means positive weight, green means close to zero weight. So basically, this is showing us what are the points in space and in time that contain the code for the adjective when the adjective is on the screen and subsequently when the noun is on the screen. But if you look hard, you notice that in this little region here, from about 200 to 400 milliseconds, which coincidentally corresponds to movie number 1, when most of those semantic features are actually being generated in the brain as you're reading, that the code for the adjective over here is almost the inverse of the code for the adjective here. So wherever you see dark blue, you see dark red, and vice versa. Again, what that means, I don't know, but in MEG, the signal is generated, it's a magnetic field generated by electrical currents running along axon bundles. And so basically, inverting means switching the direction of the currents. We don't know what this means yet, but you could hypothesize perhaps there's information flowing one way when you're reading the adjective and being replayed at exactly the same time relative to noun onset as it was generated relative to adjective onset, in a way to superimpose the semantics of that noun, or of that adjective, onto your perceiving of the semantics of the noun. Okay, so that's the second example. Let me give one more, and then I'll wind up. But a third project is to try to study sentence reading. And so we've been showing people a number of things, but in this study, simple active and passive sentences. Again, one word at a time. And so we then get MEG activity. Again, this is time versus MEG sensors. And here you can see every 500 milliseconds a new word appearing. In fact, if you just look at the MEG activity, you can very easily pick out where the onsets of those words are. And then you see this very interesting brain-wide burst of activity after the sentence has been read. So what's going on? So one question we're interested in is, as you're reading that sentence, which information about the sentence is being encoded when in your brain? Which of those words are you thinking about as you go along word by word reading? So if I show you, think about, well, let's just think about the sentence. Suppose the first word is the. Your brain probably thinks, okay, the. Probably the next thing is a noun. Peach, okay, peach, the peach. Probably this is going to be the agent of a sentence. Usually the agent appears first. Was, okay, maybe the peach was delicious. Found, peach was found. Okay, maybe that's the end of the sentence. No, there's another word. The peach was found by, peach was found by a, probably peach, you know now that peach is not the agent of the sentence. It's not the subject, it's the object. It's not the patient, it's not the agent, it's the patient. Found by a dog, okay. So if we look at where in time you can decode the identity of the first noun in the peach was found by a dog. Purple here shows where we can, with statistical significance, decode that the first word was peach. One time is, of course, when you're reading peach. That's good. Then again, not until A. And when you see the word A, your brain reactivates the semantic code for peach and dog. So what could be happening there? Well, an obvious hypothesis is one thing your brain must do is figure out if it's trying to put together the proposition eaten by peach dog or eats dog peach. It's got to figure out what's the agent in the patient. As we were going word by word through that, I believe your brain thinks initially peach is probably going to be the agent. Later, it's got to shift that around. It's got to rebind peach to be the patient, not the agent. In order to do that rebinding, and it's right here where you have enough information to know that that's got to happen. To do that rebinding, you want to do a check, right? If I say the purple was eaten by a dog, that doesn't make sense. So you've got to do a semantic check on whether peach is an acceptable semantically role filler for being the patient of an eating action. And indeed, and hypothesis is that could be exactly why your brain decides to reactivate the semantics of peach at that point. Whereas, on the other hand, if we have just an active sentence, like the dog found the peach, we can decode dog when it appears and also when you're looking at this, but we don't see it very much later. Okay. So there's, again, an example of the kinds of questions we can ask and start to get answers to in terms of language processing in the brain. And this is just a very, early step. We know something now about where and when different kinds of information are coded while you're doing reading of individual words or sentences, and we have some work on stories, Harry Potter stories as well. But if you ask where could we go, where could this lead, I think the goal that we would like to pursue is one that kind of mirrors what people have been able to do with computer vision. In computer vision, we have computer algorithms that perform the task. We have data from the brain performing the same computer vision task. And as Tommaso talked about this morning, we have a bridge between some of the activity in those convolutional neural network hidden layers and the corresponding activity in different parts of visual cortex. So the analog to that here would be having a computer program that can understand simple syntax sentences like this, later complex syntax, but let's start with these kind of sentences, and can understand them in the sense that it has a lot of background knowledge about the world. That's what it needs to know in order to understand whether peach is an acceptable patient for an eating action, and to try to build a computer program that not only understands those sentences, but the information trace, the data flow that it produces, the sequence of operations it produces, become the latent structure for predicting the sequence of neural activity that we see in the brain. So this would be a way to, in analogy with what's done in computer vision, try to build computational models of language understanding that both perform the task and make generative predictions for what happens in the brain. So let me end there. I want to end before I get shut down by others. And thank you. And let me also finally, all of us maybe thank you for a fantastic meeting.